In this lecture, we're going to look at the requirements of a bottling room within a winery. And the way I'm going to start this out, in fact, the way that it's going to happen all the way through is that we're going to talk about the ideal bottling line. And maybe in this way, we can like set the bar really high. What I find is that in many wineries, we can specify this is what the bottling line should be. And then when it comes down to, in the end, this is the money we've got to work with, we sometimes have to scale back on certain things and maybe not do the full-blown packaging system that I'd like to see anyway. So it's always a compromise, it seems. However, I would say that in terms of bottling, this is a place where as little compromise as possible would be the best. But let's see what we've got, and we'll see what we can actually implement in your winery designs. So we'll start at the beginning as usual. In other words, what is the purpose of a bottling room? Well, it's a space for packaging wine. This is pretty obvious. And not only is it a place to package wine, but it should be a very much a dedicated place. In other words, it's not used for anything else. It houses the packaging equipment, usually referred to as the bottling line. It's easily cleaned, so it's a sanitary environment. That means that the walls then, and the floor, and even the ceiling should all be able to be sanitized after use and also before use. In other words, it's going to be kept really clean. It should also be safe, so you've got machinery in there. And if you've got a monoblock, or in other words, an automatic bottling system, then you've got a lot of moving parts. You've got glass bottles involved most of the time. And basically, if you have an environment that it ensures the safety of the workers, it's going to be much better in the long run. More efficient, safer, of course, less costly because you won't have as much breakage and or injury to workers. All this combines, in other words, to make it more feasible and more doable and more desirable, I think. Also, it needs to be efficient. So bottling is one of those jobs in the winery that, well, it's actually pretty monotonous and boring and routine. And it's easy to kind of get lost in your own thoughts and forget what you're doing, and pretty soon everything's crashing, literally. So we want to try to make it as efficient as possible so that things go smoothly. It happens very quickly, and bottling doesn't become kind of a monotonous chore that it often is. These are kind of some of the reasons why we want to have a good bottling wine and why it's important to have good specifications for it. So let's look at the ideal bottling setup, and we're going to look at it as basically its own room. In other words, a self-contained area that has in it basically just the filler itself. An allowance for some way to sanitize the bottles, or at least clean them in some way. Let me kind of divert here a little bit and talk about bottles as they come to you from the manufacturer and ultimately from your distributor. They are sanitary, sterile even, when they come out of the bottling or out of the bottle plant. You think about glass. It gets heated up very hot. It then gets cooled down and through probably some very technical ways, and then it gets packaged and it gets put into cardboard. So practically speaking, none of things in there should be able to contaminate wine and give you problems. However, once it's left the bottling plant, it then gets put into trucks. The trucks get delivered, or the bottles get delivered to a warehouse where they get stored. They go from the warehouse again into a truck, then they get delivered to the winery. So in other words, there's plenty of opportunity for bottles to get messed up between the bottle plant and the winery. One of the key ways to avoid this is order what you need and have them delivered just in time. That way they're not sitting around kind of tying up space or getting dirty for that matter before you actually get to use them. One of the biggest problems, in fact, that I've seen with bottles is not so much that they have yeast or bacteria in them that can contaminate wine, but they're just oftentimes full of cardboard and even little glass dust bits. So for that reason, I think one of the best ways to handle bottles as you bring them in is simply to blow compressed air into them, filtered, clean compressed air, or also nitrogen or carbon dioxide if that's available. This blows out the dust that's in there, and to some degree, although it's not perfect, in fact it's far from perfect, also displaces some of the air in the bottle, and if you're using an inert gas, can end up then with reduction in oxidation, or at least the potential for oxidation from bottling. So this is what I mean by bottle sanitizing. At least in some way, you're removing some of the dirt and dust and bits of stuff that ends up in the bottles just from storage. The next step would be filling, so you should have your filler in the bottling room. And finally, some way to close the bottle. So in other words, you're bringing bottles in, you're cleaning them, you're filling them, you're closing them. The package then leaves the bottling room and goes into another room where you can capsule and label it. In other words, everything is done outside of that room with the exception of the filling itself. And this is basically done to ensure that everything is kept as clean as possible and the possibility for contamination is minimized. So where should the bottling room be? Primarily, the first thing should be away from the fermentation area. In other words, you don't want active fermentations going on that are going to spew yeast cells and bacteria cells into the air, which then can end up on the filler or in the bottles, in the wine that's being filtered, and so on. In other words, sanitation, if you remember the definition of that, or if you haven't had sanitation yet, you'll learn, is basically the process of reducing the population of organisms to a point where they can be controlled. So, in other words, we're talking about sanitation here. We're keeping things away from the active fermentation so that we're reducing the population that can infect and affect the wine as it's being bottled. It also should be isolated from a general traffic area. In other words, we don't want a lot of people walking through the bottling room to get to the restroom, or to get to the break room, or to get to the chemical storage room that's for some reason got built on the other side of it. Every time someone walks in, the potential for contamination increases, and we're trying to create an environment in which this does not happen. So the bottling area should be its own little unit, set aside out of the general way so that there's less chance for contamination. And of course, it should not be used for storage for anything when it's not being used. Basically, all this is done just to reduce the possibility of contamination during bottling and also while the machine sits idle, so in other words, in between bottlings. We're trying to create an environment in which everything is kept as clean as possible, both during and in the off times. And one way that we actually can kind of keep things clean is that this is going to be an enclosed room. It will have a door on it. It'll be glass walled if necessary so that you can see into it, which is actually handy because then you can monitor the machine. You can see what's happening without necessarily having to be right in there with it, or at least having a bunch of people in there. We're going to maintain positive pressure inside that room. So in other words, we're going to slightly pressurize it by blowing filtered air into the room through some kind of a ventilation system. What this effectively does is it creates pressure against any openings. So for example, we've decided that this room is not going to be used for pallets of bottles. So the pallets sit outside the room. There's a conveyor belt that starts there. It goes through a curtain, an air curtain most places, that basically creates some kind of a barrier. The bottles pass through that curtain into the bottle room. So we're dumping them out of the cases outside. Maybe we're even blowing the dust out of them outside, putting them on the line. They pass into the room. They get filled. They get corked or screw capped. Then they pass out of the room where they get labeled and capsuled. Those little holes where the bottles come into the room and out of the room are going to be the only thing that is open to the outside during the actual bottling operation. So by pressurizing the room, we're always going to have air blowing out through those holes and effectively not allowing anything to come back in that way. So we're keeping positive pressure, filtered air, so that everything stays really clean in there. Some other requirements for this room it's going to be space that is dedicated strictly to bottling. Um, so you need to make it, in terms of real estate, we'll say inside the winery, it's going to take up space, but we don't want it to take up too much space, only that amount that's needed. And one of the things that should be taken into consideration then, you've got the overall footprint of the bottling machine itself. You're also going to need to make sure you've got room so that if you have to get in there for maintenance, you can easily get to all aspects of the machine. Because I guarantee you that the part that breaks during the bottling is not going to be the one that sits up on top, right, in easy access. It's going to be the thing that you have to crawl into the machine or pull the panels off or in some way get your body into a place that you never thought you're going to be able to. And that's how you're going to fix it. So you want to make it as easy as possible while at the same time controlling access to it so that it's not, you know, so big that it's hard to keep clean or it takes up a lot of space, but not so small that you can't work on it. Of course, everything in there has to be very easily cleaned and sanitized. It's quite common to use ceramic tile, like a very high finish ceramic tile, which can be sanitized, very durable, cleaned. Um, I've seen steel used. I've seen this fiberglass reinforced plastic, or FRP as it's known. It works. It's not quite as good. It's often used in commercial kitchens. Basically anything like that that you can, if necessary, hose down or at least clean and sanitize in some way. So along with surfaces that are easily cleaned and sanitized, you need to have a way to get rid of any water or any spillage that happens into the room. So if a bottle breaks on the machine, you're able to go in, clean it on the spot, wash everything down the drain, and squeegee the floor dry before you begin again. So in other words, no puddles should be left on the floor. That means that your drains should be adequately sloped to, and also that they are easily cleaned themselves. So it may not be enough just to have a basic spill in the middle of the floor, spill meaning the drain, where the wine goes down into a trap or something like that and then sits there and festers while you're bottling above it. So we want to make sure that all the waste is taken away from the room, and what is left can be cleaned, sanitized, even the drains, and kept it in that condition between bottlings and during bottlings. So the last thing to consider with this would also be the workers themselves. So if you have somebody who's been working outside in the vineyard perhaps on a muddy day, and they come into the winery and you say, I need somebody in here right now, they should have the sense, and you should have the sense to say, stop right there, clean your shoes off, change your shoes, put on overshoes, whatever is necessary so that that person does not track spoilage organisms, dirt, anything into the bottling room. Likewise, if they have dirty clothes on, they should be either covered or ideally changed. So we want to keep everything in there as clean as possible, including workers. Kind of as an aside to this, not really related to winery design, but worth mentioning many times, if you're working with a true HACCP plan, so let's say that we get to the point where the FDA is requiring that all wineries have HACCP plans, then one of the requirements may be that you do not have button-down shirts either. So no buttons, because buttons can come off and contaminate food. Therefore, they're not considered part of a sterile or sanitary environment in terms of food processing and food safety. For wine, that's probably not a problem, although I can, from personal experience, if I found a button in my wine, I probably would go back to the winery and say, something needs to change here. So it's just worth thinking about. So this kind of wraps up, like I say, a very general, broad overview of what a bottling room should look like. As I say, this is ideal, but since you're doing a model winery, why not make it ideal? So this is what I would shoot for in that, the highest possible conditions that you can get to bottle your wine.